Hi, my name's Justin Buckley. I'm Executive Manager of Gardens for the National Trust in Victoria, Australia. My talk today is on water stories from the underground at Rippon, which is based around a water-based project we did here in the last year or so. So it's a case study, a little different to some of the big picture talks you might have been listening to already. And I guess we just thought it might be interesting in terms of the importance of interpretation, in terms of climate change resilience to heritage properties, and also the importance of a local focus. And so just a brief overview of Rippon Estate. It's the flagship garden property of the National Trust in Victoria. It's 14 acres of gardens, 6 kilometres from the CBD in the southeast Bayside suburbs of Melbourne. Certainly significant for its garden as much as anything else. It's got a lovely mansion, lovely buildings, but as a gardens manager, we're quite proud of the fact that Rippon is really significant for the 19th century. Pleasure gardens remain almost entirely intact, and Rippon was deemed so significant it was added to the National Heritage List by the federal government in the last decade. So Rippon was the family home of the Sargood family. So they're a very wealthy merchant family, but also very active in politics. And Sir Frederick, that's him on the left, and on the far right, held various ministries in the early colony of Victoria, including the Water Ministry, which will make sense as I go along. And he was also elected to the first Australian Federal Parliament at Federation in 1900. So a quick overview of the main features of Rippon. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's got all the hallmarks you'd expect of a grand 19th century Victorian estate. A mansion, of course. It's got a really amazing surviving fernery from the 19th century, one of the world's greats, I would suggest. And it's really the crowning glory of the garden from my perspective. Also surviving conservatories from the 19th century that, the garden and the house were definitely linked in the vision for the property. For example, the original dining room, you left the dining room, you walked through a conservatory, which took you through a glassed area to the ballroom, which then led directly into the fernery itself. There was a large working side to the property originally. We have a small component of that left today, including a heritage orchard with 120 different varieties of apple and pear. Also, of course, classic Victorian rockwork and grottos, as you would expect from the 19th century, including this cave that takes you behind the waterfall next to the lake. We have a lookout tower with views across the bay that sits on top of the grotto. A 1930s swimming pool. This is really the only significant change that's been made to the property in 150 years. The last owner, Louisa Jones, when she inherited the property in the 1930s, demolished the existing ballroom and built a swimming pool. And tennis courts with a tennis pavilion. There's still surviving boathouse, summer house, archery hut. So yeah, all of those 19th century buildings have survived 150 years of private ownership and contribute significantly to the property today. And a large ornamental lake, which is of most interest for the subject of this talk. It covers 4,000 square metres of the garden. So when I say Rippon Estate, it was 45 acres originally, included a village accommodation for staff, a 10-acre paddock, a firing range where the local militia trained, and there was a lot of mouths to feed on the property, so there was a big working side to the garden. There's a couple of photographs of that here, including this large orchard area, including areas under netting, under glass, that took up now what is the surrounding residential streets. And on the left, we have the earliest photo we have of Rippon. So you can see the kind of landscape that this mansion was plonked on. And as I said, Sir Frederick was a very passionate gardener, and no expense was spared on the garden. And of course, it's a very highly urbanised part of the city today, but this is Elstonwick in 1880, just around the corner from the property on Glen Ira Road. And this is very typical of the vegetation, and noting the standing water. next to that gum tree, which was also a significant feature of this part of the country. And you can see here at the same time, Rippon had basically incorporated that landscape into its garden. So in the centre of that photo, you'll see a remnant eucalypt, red gum, and what was presumably a naturally wet part of the property was converted into an ornamental lake. And interestingly, that the trunk of that remnant gum tree still stands in place today, again telling an incredible story of the pre-colonial landscape. And over the years, the lake was significantly enlarged to the size it is today. This is it in 1903. And the lake serves a lot more than just an ornamental purpose. It's actually a water storage reservoir for the property. And all our irrigation water is stored in the lake, and we pump it around the property. And that was part of the design of right back in the Sargwood period. So this sketches out the design for what was essentially an integrated water management plan for the property that was incorporated into Sargwood's design. So to the east of us, a couple of kilometres away, is today's Caulfield Park. At the time, it was known as Paddy Swamp, a naturally wet area, and that was drained, and all the local streams and standing water was put underground into the stormwater system and flows onto the bay. Just around the corner, a couple of blocks away, on what was the edge of the property, a small diversion was taken of that water, and it was brought over to be stored in the lake. So water is captured from offsite. It's also captured on site from the roof of the mansion, and all the outbuildings are also diverted into the lake, and that water is used to irrigate the property. And it's and that's meant that Rippon actually is 95% or more self-sufficient for water, which is an incredible asset to have. Any excess water that overflows from the lake returns back to that system, flowing back onto Port Phillip Bay. And even the reduced Rippon as it is today, drainage is crucial to the property. And if you can make out a lot of those blue lines, those are still active today and all need to be maintained. And if they're not, water will back up all the way and flood the house. And the biggest challenge, of course, with a 150-year-old drainage system is the tree roots. And you can see Daniel, one of our gardeners here, demonstrating some of the problems we have to deal with. So there's literally a maze of these drains and pits all over the property, and for many years they've been maintained by our garden team. It's become increasingly hard to do, expensive, dangerous, and as you can see, some of these, as I said, are 3.5 metres deep, and up until a few years ago, this meant our garden team going down there and removing tree roots by hand. So in 2018, we were successful in applying for a federal grant. And in order to bolster that application, we had a component in there for interpretation. We knew we had a pretty incredible 19th century engineering system under our feet. We'd never really known, well, how do you interpret something? And that was the big question we had to ask ourselves, is how do you interpret something that you can't see? So aside from some maps and plans of the existing system, we had really nothing that we could show anyone. And yeah, how do you go about telling the story of a system when you can't actually show it to people? We were lucky enough to come across a team from Monash University here in Melbourne who are also working on these issues, but particularly around the water system of southeast Melbourne. So they've been doing a lot of work on hidden heritage, and I guess the idea of the counter city below the streets, and working on what's been described as an underground atlas of Melbourne. And it was our intention to work with them and put Rippon within that wider context, within the landscape, rather than just within the gates and the fences on the boundary of the property here. Now, it's very hard to cover in a couple of minutes just the detail that the Monash team went into, but I'll try to. So they've done a lot of work mapping the history of the landscape here in the southeast of Melbourne. And as you can see from these old maps, there's water everywhere. It was really a wet part of town. It's quite counterintuitive if you're out there digging in the sandy soils here in the middle of summer. But basically, water was a problem in the colonial days, and they wanted to develop. If we go further back in time, they've also mapped what some very significant changes there's been in this area. If you can make out in the centre, there's a little pink dot. That's Rippon, quite close to where Port Phillip Bay stands now. But research shows that within only the last few thousand years, there's been huge changes to Port Phillip Bay. It was actually inundated, a grassy plain within the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. And in fact, the Boonwurrung have passed stories down of that for those thousands of years in what's been described as a time of chaos. If we go back further in time, we see that there's been very significant changes to the landscape in this part of Australia as well. So if you can make out a pink dot near the centre of that picture there, that's Rippon today, close to the shores of Port Phillip Bay. But we know that only within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, Port Phillip Bay was actually a grassy plain you could walk across. And the Boonwurrung have actually passed down stories of this change for those thousands of years in what's been described as a time of chaos. Those plains were inundated, and the sea is now covered. So why was Sargood obsessed with drainage and went to such lengths at Rippon? Well, this map shows exactly why. So this is the immediate vicinity that we're in. Again, around the centre, you can make out Rippon Estate, and this is a map of historical flooding events across the whole area. To the right of that map is Caulfield Park, or as it was known, Paddy Swamp, and as I mentioned, that was all drained. So if you follow these blue lines working their way across from the right of this map, so these blue lines working their way from the right to the left of this map show all those natural waterways, and as they were diverted under the roads, under houses, and as they flow today all the way down to the bay, including to the south of us what was the Elster Creek. That still flows today, all underground. And that drainage hasn't entirely solved the problems. If there's enough rainfall and if the tide is high enough, the suburb of Elwood, which is between us here and Port Phillip Bay, will flood semi-regularly. So from an interpretation point of view, I guess following those streams was very important because it tells us what the pre-colonial landscape of the area was. And of course, that tells you the story of First Nations connection to country. So it was very important for us that we had that voice front and centre of the interpretation. And so again, the Monash team worked with Carolyn Briggs, who's a Boonwurrung elder, and they interviewed her and walked her around the property. So Nawit's voice is the first voice you'll hear in the interpretation, welcoming you to country and asking you to look and listen and pay attention through the app and audio-visual work that the Monash team developed. So in terms of revealing the hidden, sound was identified as being very important to this project, as sound reveals more than you can just see. So a lot of work went into recording the sounds of the environment, including the underground. And you'll see here we're recording sounds of that stream that flows from Caulfield Park on towards Rippon to irrigate the property, and where it flows underground. You hear the water running, and hopefully you can hear it more into some occasional pumping with the sound of vehicles driving over manholes reverberating through the drainage system. So the team used various specialist microphones to record all manner of sounds that aren't normally apparent to us, including hydrophones, which they placed in the lake. And when you're standing by the lake, you would assume there's no noise at all happening within that water. But when you drop one of these microphones in there, you'll find it's very different indeed. But all of those sounds are being recorded below the water. So all of those sound recordings were put into 5 different layers, and they were all looped. So sounds from beneath the ground surface right up to sounds in the sky. And the idea is that visitors download the app on their phone, and as they scan the phone vertically towards the ground, towards the sky, they move through those different layers of sound, also interspersed with Noeet's commentary. And the augmented reality component is the pipes that are currently hidden beneath the ground are actually brought to life, and you can see where they are underneath your feet through that augmented reality. So although it's a highly modified landscape, the lake does serve a very important purpose in this part of town. It's an area that has the lowest public open space of any municipality in Melbourne, in the state of Victoria, in fact. The lake is also central to the natural values of the site. So Rippon has been identified as a top 5 biodiversity hotspot in the city of Glen Eira, which is an area with the lowest amount of public open space in the whole state. So it serves a hugely important purpose for locals. The main things we've learned from this project in relation to, I guess, building relevance for heritage properties in challenging environments has been around stories. Stories are really central to heritage properties, and often those stories have multiple layers. It's also very important that the heritage places are put within a wider context, within their wider landscape and their wider community. And to build ongoing support from those communities, you really need to be at the heart of people's lives and what they're doing there. And heritage places need not be relics. They embody a variety of values central to community wellbeing. If you'd like to delve further into this subject, there are some really great visual essays that were also part of this project that are soon to be launched on our website. If you put Hidden Ripponlea into your search engine, you'll be able to find them and have a sneak preview. But thank you very much for watching.